Okay, at 14 after, that's close enough. And we will go ahead and get started here. Thanks again, everyone who's joined us today, and particularly everyone who has opted to stay with us through the bitter end of our 3 presentations. Again, these will all be available through the St. Louis Mercantile Library's Missouri Digital Library and through the Mercantile Library's YouTube page. And we will be posting that link. I'll send a link to everyone who has joined us. Takes about a day or 2 to get the files processed and put online as individual presentations. But I'll send a link to everyone who registered, even everybody who didn't have a chance to join us today. They'll be able to participate vicariously. And again, if anyone has questions that they think of after today and would like to ask Bernie or John or me a question, just email me at the library and I could get you in contact with everyone. So our final presentation is going to be the transplant from the East, talking about St. Louis and Missouri's railroads in the 19th century, which is an interesting topic because if you think about the 19th century in the state of Missouri, it was very much tied to river transportation, particularly in St. Louis. The city seal for St. Louis has a steamboat on it, not a train. But then if you go to City Hall in Kansas City, Missouri, you see bronze plaques inside with the Burlington Zephyr cast in them. So it is a city that has a state that has adapted to changing transportation technology, and that all happens in the 19th century. And the story starts a lot earlier than many people who are really not deep into the weeds in railroad history might think. And it's 1836 here in the state of Missouri. This is the old federal courthouse, a structure that is still standing to this day as part of the Gateway National Monument all along the St. Louis riverfront. And this was the site in 1836 for a railroad convention where representatives from 11 counties in the state of Missouri got together to talk about this new technology that's been around for about 10 years at this point, and how the commercial and government interests in the state need to start looking at railroads, partially as an existential threat to the existing river transportation infrastructure, but also as an opportunity to expand the state's commercial reach. Now, Missouri is in yellow here, and this is basically where the state's sitting in the 1830s. It's the middle of the country in terms of north-south alignment. It's almost to the far western border with Mexico. And it contains one of the most important river connections for westward expansion. And it's the Mississippi to Missouri River that goes north and west. If you are ever interested in the Lewis and Clark expedition, it's the Missouri River that serves as the highway for the expedition and had already been a well-established trading route for the fur trade, which was helping to make St. Louis a great commercial center. When the US started exploring and developing Louisiana Territory, particularly on the Pacific coast in what became Oregon Territory, the Missouri River was an important highway for immigrants, military expeditions, and traders going west. Now, this is great if you're Missouri. You've got the highway. You've got both ends of the highway, essentially. You know, this is the jumping off point for people going west and the big transfer point for goods going to the east, to the major markets. And the state was making a very decent living as a highway for commerce. In addition to St. Louis, there was a developing town that was taking advantage of its location on the Missouri River and the beginnings of westward expansion and settlement called St. Joseph, Missouri, which is north of what is today Kansas City, that was enjoying its place as the beginning of the Oregon Trail, as a major fur trade base as a major connection where negotiations with the native tribes was underway. And again, this is a city that is enjoying its river commerce. For the rest of the state, you know, you're all trying to use rivers to get to the Missouri. And existentially, if you're Missouri, you're looking at this railroad technology that's coming about as a competition to the rivers. And it concerns you that cities like Memphis, which does not enjoy access to an east-west river system, they could build a railroad across Arkansas and go into the Western territories. People could look at developing the Iowa Territory and short circuit the Mississippi and Missouri River and take advantage of Chicago, which was just developing as a lake port on Lake Michigan, as a means to connect New York, which now enjoys the Erie Canal, with the Midwest via the Great Lakes and a railroad. So these delegates from these 11 counties got together and they decided they were going to back 4 railroad projects that they felt could help Missouri maintain its place in the great commercial and economic network of the country. This is a much later map, but it's helpful that it has the counties listed, and I can use that to show the various points here. So there were 4 projects. The first one, honestly, was one of the most commonsensical ones you could think of. And it was a project that was to build a railroad from St. Louis south into the Ozark foothills of Washington County, Missouri, which is this county here, and start tapping into the iron ore deposits in that area. They had already been developed. They had been mined for decades by the time Louisiana was purchased, and the raw ore was being transported by road to a river port and then to a furnace somewhere else. A railroad would drastically lower the cost and increase the efficiency of that process. A second project was proposed as an add-on to this that would build a railroad extension into Crawford County, which is this spot here, to the Merrimack Iron Works. So you would have 2 potential sources of traffic, freight traffic at least, iron ore to the iron furnace or iron ore to a river port on its own, and finished iron to another trading port. Very commonsensical. You would think this one would be a slam dunk. The only disadvantage to this project is you're literally building into the mountain range, and that starts to get expensive. The third project, and I thought this one was quite clever when they put out their wording. They were going to build a railroad to Fayette, Missouri, which is this little dot in Howard County. And after you got to Fayette, they said the railroad can go as far west as it needs to in whatever direction it needs to. They thought, well, maybe it might go to St. Joseph, maybe it might go to somewhere else, maybe it might go south and west, maybe it might go straight north. They didn't tie it down, which if you follow some of the other railroads that were very parochial in their development on the East Coast, they had a set start point and a set end point, and if you wanted to change it, it became extremely difficult. Well, in this case, they just said, let's not set the end point. The fourth project was a railroad to Cooper County and then to the junction of the Kansas and Missouri rivers. This is basically going to Kansas City before Kansas City became a place. It takes advantage of short-circuiting and increasing the speed of traffic that would normally be taking the Missouri River. It still gets you to a river port and still sets you up for connection with either people going into Oregon Territory or people going into the Kansas Territory. These areas are not getting developed yet. Kansas isn't getting as developed yet, but people are settling there. And it's a kind of a pretty far-thinking proposal. So these 4 projects get proposed. And once they've decided and voted, the next thing they do is this convention starts sending delegates to the state capitol. This is the state capitol at Jefferson City, Missouri. This is not a current picture, but this building is the current state capitol building. So what they start doing is you have to get a charter. So they start lobbying for a charter and get that from the state legislature. The charter allows that company to exist in the state of Missouri and acquire land and run the company and run trains. Basically, it's the fundamental piece of paperwork to run a railroad anywhere in any state. And these 4 projects were not the only 4. Between 1836 and 1839, 21 railroads were chartered in the state of Missouri, but 0 miles of track were built. Why was that? Partially, they just didn't have the critical mass of funding and support statewide to get the capital together to build the railroads. In other cases, there was skepticism and resistance from the steamboat interests. But the nice thing about these charters is, for the most part, they all stayed in place. Now, in the 1840s, things change. We have the Mexican War, the annexation of Texas, and the addition of a huge swath of territory in the south and western portions of what is now the United States. And now Missouri is actually in a much more attractive position to get settlement and development going in that region because of the Missouri River, because of the Kansas River, and because of its proximity to things like the Arkansas River. The downside is these rivers aren't as helpful to settlement as the Missouri River is in getting you to the Northwest. But still, Missouri's in a very good spot. And in fact, many of the troops that wind up going to New Mexico are out of Missouri and they march overland. They utilize pre-existing trade connections via the Santa Fe Trail, which actually would end in Missouri. So there is an existing road network. It's not as efficient as a river, and if you can build a railroad, so much the better. The idea of building railroads into the Western territories, particularly the newly acquired one, gets a national boost from a guy named Asa Whitney. Whitney's a New Englander. He's actually an ocean-going ship captain, and in 1844, he participated in a voyage from the East Coast to China and back. And to be quite frank, he hated the trip. It was awful. You had to go around the tip of South America and go back to Boston. And he thought, you know, we've just got all this land from Mexico, including one of the finest natural harbors in the world, San Francisco Bay. Let's look at building a transcontinental railroad so these merchant routes can be drastically shortened. It's safer, and we can get more trips a year out of this, which, if you have studied any modern ship issues, efficient number of trips you can get out of your ocean-going vessel is a prime factor of the economics of the business. And Whitney's saying, look, just build a railroad. We can get all the stuff from China to the West Coast, turn around and go on another trip, and just ship all of this stuff to the customers in the East, and we don't have to go around South America. And he starts going around to all the state legislatures in the US and pitching this project. He writes a very extensive proposal and gets it published. And places like the Maine state legislature think this is a great idea. The Pennsylvania state legislature thinks this is a great idea. Why is he going to these state legislatures and not the federal government? One thing he knows, the state legislatures are the people that select the US senators at this time. So if he gets state legislatures on his side, they'll help select senators that are on his side, which means the federal government will start being on his side. So it's a very shrewd move on his part. So once you've got these state legislatures starting to support candidates for the Senate, you've got people in your state, particularly here in Missouri, who think railroads are a great idea, particularly railroads that go west outside of your state. How do you get your railroad built? Well, first thing, you get your charter. We talked about that earlier on. The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to need land. Now, one option is you can just outright buy it, and that's expensive. And honestly, If you can get the land for free, do it. The other thing you're going to need is money. And private capital at this time just isn't sufficient to get funding for a major railroad project, let alone multiple railroad projects underway in the US at the same time. The East Coast railroads are already experiencing this financial pinch. Then you're going to need civil engineers, and there's a limited supply of them. You're going to need raw materials or manufactured goods. In the 1830s and 1840s and even into the 1850s, there's just not enough iron rails being produced in the US to support the market. So you're going to have to buy those from overseas, and generally you're probably going to have to pay a tariff. You're going to want to see if you can get that kind of stuff remedied. So the first thing you do after you get your charter, you start writing these things called memorials. And you're either going to go to a state legislature or to the US Congress with your memorials, and you're going to ask for favors. The state legislature, you're going to say, can we have some state land? The federal memorials are going to go to the House and the Senate, and they're going to say, can we have federal land? And oh, by the way, can you hook us up and make us exempt from iron tariffs, because we need rails for this great project that's going to benefit everybody in the country. This is going on with every railroad in the US, and Missouri railroads are just the same as all of them, and they're going to start working with their friends. So who are their friends? In the US Senate, Thomas Hart Benton is your guy. If you want to build a railroad in Missouri, Benton is your buddy. And in fact, if you have any doubts about Thomas Hart Benton's feelings about railroads, just look at the bottom of this engraving with the 440 American pulling the freight train. Yeah, Thomas Hart Benton likes trains. He's also a member of the St. Louis Mercantile Library, which is celebrating its 175th anniversary this year. And I highly recommend coming down and visiting us and seeing our exhibition. Just a treasure trove of things we've collected. So that was my shameless plug for the day. Senator Benton is a St. Louis resident. He's a huge force in the Democratic Party. He had been originally a rival of Andrew Jackson, and eventually became an ally. He became a staunch ally of James K. Polk, particularly during the Mexican War. He was in favor of any enterprise that would expand the economic reach and development of the state of Missouri. So adding land from Mexico, he was in favor of it. Railroad development, Senator Benton is in favor of it. So if you can get Senator Benton on your side in the Senate, you're probably going to get a bill through Congress that will help you get federal land, which is great. And there is federal land available still in Missouri. Even though it's a state, there's still federal land that has not been sold to a private individual or a commercial business. Now, inside the state of Missouri, you have legislative members you want to talk to as well. This is Robert M. Stewart. He's a Missouri state senator. He's serving in Jefferson City in the 1840s and the 1850s. He's originally from New York. His family moved west to Kentucky and then to Missouri. And at this point, he has decided to settle in St. Joseph. St. Joseph is the boom town. He is personally in favor of any project that's going to help the community of St. Joseph, Missouri develop. But again, a rising tide raises all boats. If he can do something that helps a railroad in Missouri that eventually St. Joseph could take advantage of, great. He is in favor of pretty much every railroad project that he sees. He's going to be more in favor if you pitch it as something advantageous to St. Joseph, but at least he's not going to really take the wind out of your sails. He's going to be a person you're going to want to cultivate to get state land in Missouri that had not been sold to anyone, and get a land grant to build your railroad there. Now, if you're looking more at a local level, you're going to want your mayor and your newspaper guy in favor. And in Kansas City, which at this point in the 1850s is just really getting together, Johnston Likens is the mayor of Kansas City, and he's a huge supporter of railroads in the town, mainly because he wants the town to overtake St. Louis overtake St. Joseph as a commercial and economic center on the western side of the state. And the guy on the right is Robert T. Van Horn, who's a newspaper publisher and a tireless promoter of Kansas City development. So these are not the only people in the state of Missouri who are working towards railroad development. They are exemplars at a federal, state, and local level of the kind of people who are working on various projects. So they're going to go to legislators, politicians, and pitch these ideas and get support and get laws passed to support all of the projects they're interested in. And in fact, we're going to look at really the first 7 major projects for railroads in Missouri. The first is the Hannibal and St. Joseph. This company is going to get its charter in 1846. It is the earliest of the really constructed, the charters that actually get built. This one is the first one to get its charter. And with it comes a state land grant and federal land grants. And you can see that on this map in this shaded region. And it's going to link the 2nd and 3rd largest cities in the state of Missouri. It is going to spend a lot of time after they take the land they need to build the railroad track. They're going to start selling it off. 1, it generates cash. 2, it's going to generate business. If you get farms along your right of way, that's a customer. That's what they're looking at. And this is what every railroad that gets a land grant is going to be doing. Next, the Pacific Railroad of Missouri is going to get its charter 3 years later, and it's going to start construction in 1851. Coincidentally, the first shovels of dirt on the Pacific Railroad and the Hannibal and St. Joseph both start in 1851. You can get the charter, you've got to get your land, you got to get your money together, and that all takes time. This is straightforward. We're going to link St. Louis with Kansas City. It is going to essentially become a land version of the Missouri River. And the Missouri River navigationally is sometimes very difficult to deal with. Ideally, this will simplify the process and encourage trade between these 2 points. Also, now that Hannibal and St. Joseph are building a railroad, there is intra-state competition to make sure that St. Louis maintains its dominance as the largest city in the state, and Kansas City wants to start competing with St. Joseph. Now, the third project is kind of a hedge your bet if you're St. Louis. And it's not the Hannibal and St. Joseph, which is shown here. It's this little railroad that goes out in Macon County, down across the Missouri River here at St. Charles and into St. Louis. This is called the North Missouri Railroad. It gets its charter in 1851. And just straight up, this is St. Louis hedging its bet. If the Hannibal and St. Joseph gets built first, we are still not going to be left behind because this is the backup plan if the Pacific Railroad doesn't get done first. Pretty straightforward idea. It actually is a pretty good project for it's a limited scope project. It's not going to be ruinously expensive because of length. It does have a big river to cross, so that's going to be a complication. But hey, it's the 19th century. Science and technology are growing by leaps and bounds, as we've seen in the first 2 presentations. Surely we can figure out a way to bridge the Missouri River easily. The next project, the 4th project of all things, is actually one of the projects that really had been proposed in the 1830s, and that's that railroad down to the iron mines. This is the St. Louis Iron Mountain Southern, and they're looking to go into Pilot Knob and the Iron Mountain region of the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. And straight up, we're trying to get raw iron ore to iron works to get processed and make money that way. They do start looking over the horizon to other things, but at the very beginning, it's a pretty limited and straightforward idea, just like the original 1830s proposal. Now, this railroad does get chartered in 1851. Construction is starting not long after that. Now, between the 4th project and the 5th and 6th and 7th project getting started, the US government shows up and starts really evaluating the Mexican lands. And this is where Asa Whitney's lobbying in the state legislatures pays off. It's decided we are going to build a transcontinental railroad across the lands we've just acquired from Mexico, partially for military reasons. If the Mexicans decide they want to take this land back, The Army is going to be called upon to defend these claims. So we need a way to move troops much more easily than we did during the war, which was marching overland or trying to go around the tip of South America and landing people on the California coast. If we have a military road or a railroad, we can do this much more efficiently. The second thing is it would provide a commercial highway between the Pacific coast and the rest of the country. Railroad development has not been occurring in a vacuum. The railroads in the east have now started to expand into the middle west and the south, and what is considered the mid-south at the time, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana. So now we need to start putting the new sinews to tie things together. So what the US government decides, because Congress is already being divided sectionally, they cannot come to an agreement on the one railroad. We're going to send the best people we have to figure this out. This is stereotypically Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. We've got top men working on it right now, top men. In this case, it's the elite members of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Corps of Topographic Engineers. They're going to survey 4 major routes: the northern route, 2 Midwestern routes to the west, and a southern route to the west. These are professionals. They're going to take along scientists who are going to catalog the flora, fauna, geology, observe the meteorology, make astronomical observations, and determine scientifically which is the best route for the one transcontinental railroad the U.S. government is going to build. Senator Benton is a big backer of this project. And in fact, all the railroads look at this as both a boon and a threat. A boon if they wind up being the site of the eastern terminus of this transcontinental railroad, and a threat if they're not. To help Missouri out, Senator Benton also encourages a young Army engineer who is not part of the Pacific Railroad expeditions, named John C. Fremont, who also helpfully is married to a young woman named Jessie Benton, who happens to be the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, he supports his interest in exploring the Western lands, specifically saying, you know, John, it would really be great if you could help find a railroad route directly between St. Louis and San Francisco. And Fremont, who has the nickname of the Pathfinder as an explorer from his earlier work in California and Colorado, continues that role and tries to find ways through the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas to the West Coast from the middle of the country. Unfortunately, John Fremont, while enthusiastic, tends to get, shall we say, ahead of himself on his skis and just never is able to find an easy way between the two cities, despite many, many attempts. But he'll come back later in the Missouri Railroad scheme, despite having tough luck finding routes for us. Now, as all of this is going on in 1853 to 1855, another project, another hedge our bet project gets started in Missouri. This is called the Platte County Railroad, and it's going to run along the Missouri River in Platte County. And this is St. Joseph saying, you know, if the Hannibal and St. Joseph doesn't get built first and the Pacific Railroad makes it across the state first, we're going to make sure we are not isolated from it. So they want to build a railroad down along the Missouri River into Kansas City, where it would connect with the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. Smart play, again, limited project, pretty straightforward, goes between 2 existing towns. It's not going to be something where you're not going to have any traffic. It is going to be along the Missouri River, so you can cut some time off your travel. It's safer when the river's down or flooding. It works. So honestly, I think it's a slam dunk idea. I'm looking at it in hindsight, though. The next project comes from the southwestern corner of the state of Missouri saying, hey, guys, you know, these railroads you're building across the state are great and all, but you're kind of forgetting, you know, this whole quarter south and west, the part of the state closest to the land that actually was taken from the Mexican government during the war. So how about a little, you know, support? And oh, by the way, you know, we have votes in the State House too, and we can vote against projects that don't help us out. So at that point, a southwestern branch of the Pacific Railroad was proposed in 1853 to go from a town called Franklin, Missouri, which is in Franklin County, along the Merrimack River to go south and west using Missouri state land grants. This is a map of the land grant from the state towards Springfield. And then from Springfield, it can go into the Oklahoma territory, which is Indian territory at the time, Texas, Arkansas. There's a lot of options, but at least we're going to put Springfield in a position where, one, they're not ignored, and two, if one of the southern Midwestern routes is chosen, this is a better place to have your western terminus than have it stuck up at Kansas City, where it would miss the western connection. And finally, in 1855, when the Pacific Railroad Survey is actually just being wrapped up, a final project is proposed that has to go through Missouri, but isn't really something that they're not focusing on Missouri. It's called the Cairo and Fulton Railroad. It's mainly going to go across Arkansas, and that's what it's pitched as. And it's going to connect with the St. Louis, Iron Mountain, and Southern, and go to Cairo, Illinois as well, where the Illinois Central is being built. And the idea being it's going to go right up to the Texas border in Arkansas and, again, make itself an attractive connection with what they hope will be the chosen transcontinental railroad route. So all of this is going on in the 1850s. It's a lot of politicking, a lot of fundraising, a lot of legal and lobbying work done. What else is going on? Technologically, in the US, as John Ott pointed out, railroad development has been going quite well in terms of locomotives. We have a domestic industry that is now producing locomotives of sufficient capability to handle the topographical nature of American railroads. It can handle the grades, it can handle the curves, it can handle the traffic loads that are being put on those railroads. And it's domestic. You're not having to import this stuff anymore. Iron production is increasing. Rail production is increasing, but still the companies are going overseas if they have to. The Army, as we saw, is doing surveys west. And also, now that the Mexican War is over, a lot of these Army engineers are looking at the fact that they're not going to get promoted for a long time and therefore will not get pay raises. And if you're a private railroad company and you need an engineer and you go to an Army lieutenant and say, hey, buddy, I know you're going to be a lieutenant for at least the next 10 years until the guy ahead of you gets promoted. Would you like to make 5 to 10 times your salary working for a private company? And a lot of them say, yes, I would. And they resign their commission and take their education and go and join a private industry, railroading. Now, one thing that happens is there are only so many Army engineers you can get. There are only so many engineers you can get from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which at the time was the only other school that was doing engineering training. You sometimes have to look at going overseas and hire people like the guy on the left, James P. Kirkwood. He's a Scottish engineer. He had already been brought to the U.S. by the Erie Railroad, and he had done work constructing their line through the southern tier of New York and New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and he had a very good reputation. He was going to be hired now to build or do the design work on the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. And one of the things he brought with him was his preference for shall we say, standard railroad gauge, even though that's kind of a misnomer statement on its own. In the 19th century, railroad gauge wasn't really standard anyway. The Pacific is going to be built on broad gauge, 6 foot. The Iron Mountain is going to be built on broader gauge than 4 feet, 8.5 inches. In fact, there are many railroads in the United States that are going to have inconsistent gauges. This is not something that's a bad thing because, as Bernie pointed out, some railroads didn't want to connect with other railroads on purpose. So why would you make it easy? If you have physically different gauges, then they, for darn sure, they can't interchange with you. So you still have to figure some of these things out. By doing this, the Pacific Railroad is putting itself at risk of eastern connections, but they are hopeful that the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, which is being built in Illinois in the 1850s, across that state, across Indiana, across Ohio, and also is looking to connect with the Erie Railroad in northern Ohio long term. They hope that will be the connection, and they will have a continuous line of broad gauge track between New York City and the Pacific Ocean. Other railroads are thinking similarly about 5-foot gauge or 4 feet 8.5 inches, and they try and draw from the same pool of investors. As the railroad engineering is underway, you do have to start construction. By 1855, there's already several construction projects well underway. Your civil engineers are doing their work, your surveyors are doing their work, and the construction crews are all doing their work by hand with less than 20-foot lengths of rail on 20-foot flat cars, hand-dug embankments, hand-dug cuts. It is grueling work, and as multiple railroad projects get underway in the country and in the state, labor prices start to go up, and those construction estimates, you can just go ahead and throw them out the window now. In addition to building the railroad, you start building your infrastructure. You're going to need stations. This is one of the earliest stations in St. Louis, the permanent station. It's not the very first station for the Pacific Railroad, but it's the one that was in place in the 1860s. The Iron Mountain had a similar station of their own. This is from an 1875 Compton and Dry map. The Iron Mountain is south of downtown St. Louis. If you've ever visited the city, think of it around near where the Anheuser-Busch Brewery is, because usually if people come to visit me, we're going to go on the Anheuser-Busch tour because it's free and it's cool and there's free samples at the end. But generally every out-of-towner who visits me will get some familiarity with that part of St. Louis. And that's generally where the Iron Mountain's ending. Why are they in that part of town? Because it's a more industrial part of town and it's also near the levee. So if they want to take the iron ore or the finished pig iron and take it and put it on a steamboat, they're not that far away. The Pacific Railroad, they're pointing straight west. They're also not that far away from the levee, but they don't have the iron traffic, so they don't really need to be as close to the levee as make things as easy as this Iron Mountain does. That's just where they decided to put that depot. They didn't need to be where the Iron Mountain was going to be. All the railroads start having problems with topography to varying degrees. The North Missouri, it's not in a horrible place to build a railroad. You do have to build some bridges over smaller rivers up in that part of the state. There are some hills you have to deal with, but nothing like the more mountainous terrain you're going to see south of St. Louis and west of St. Louis as you literally start going into the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. This is the tunnel at Barrett's, which is the site of the National Museum of Transportation outside of St. Louis. It's in Kirkwood, Missouri. This is the first tunnel that the Pacific Railroad has to build. It has to be built by hand. And the tunnel was abandoned by Missouri Pacific around World War II. And it became part of the site that was deeded over to the Museum of Transportation. The tunnel did have some modifications over time to allow it to handle traffic. And of course, things needed to be stabilized. But fundamentally, this is the tunnel. This is the route that they had to build by hand. And not a lot of fun. It slows the Pacific Railroad down. It makes the Pacific Railroad a more expensive railroad to construct. It certainly doesn't help their case in trying to get across the state before the Hannibal and St. Joseph. And it's not the only major construction project that these railroads have to deal with. Any bridge is a project that slows you down because you have to build things that are sufficiently high enough to deal with flooding and things like that. What's worse, though, is there's a railroad that depends on the Pacific Railroad to get out past this hill in Pacific, or Franklin, Missouri at the time. By the time this picture was taken by John W. Barriger III, the city of Franklin had changed its name to Pacific in honor of the railroad. And the Southwest branch, well, yeah, they're building, they're in a river valley. It's not that hard to build, but it's not much good if the railroad you're trying to connect with isn't there yet. So they're kind of sitting around waiting for the Pacific Railroad to get there. And that causes them problems. And they don't get as far as they want to go because they're not moving trains and moving freight and making money like they need to help raise money. This is a continual problem for many 19th century railroads. The construction timetables and traffic timetables just don't seem to work out. Now, the Pacific does finally overcome its problem with hills. They get up to the Missouri River Valley, which is very interesting. Their routing, they decided instead of just following the river from the get-go, they try and do a shortcut and some shortcut. They get back to the Missouri River, they follow it, and they build track to Jefferson City by October of 1855. And they decide we're going to have a big party, and we're going to invite all these rich people who'd supported the project, all these politicians. The president of the railroad, Hudson Bridge, who's on the left, is going to be on the train. This is going to be great. It's not great. October 17th, 1855, the Gasconade Disaster. The train went over a bridge that had just been finished. It was not the permanent bridge over the Gasconade River. It was the temporary construction bridge. It had worked fine with work trains. It worked fine with some freight trains. But when a double-headed steam train goes over, it couldn't handle the weight of 2 locomotives on the first span at the same time. And down they went, and the cars went with them. And it was an unmitigated disaster, both physically for the railroad, but politically and public relations wise, it crippled the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. They literally killed their own supporters in the State House and their boosters in the commercial community in St. Louis. Because of this, the Pacific Railroad really starts to struggle. It's been continually over budget. The Gasconade disaster has knocked the wind out of many promoters in St. Louis's sails. And now they've literally lost people in the State House who can help them get state money, because private capital just isn't there yet. You still have to get state or federal or municipal or county bonds to help your construction. And now there just aren't those people around to help them out. And in the spirit of kicking a company while it's down, in 1857, there's an economic panic where lending in general becomes very tight because the money supply contracts. 1857, we're still using gold. When the supply of gold contracts, you have a panic, and that causes inflation, and credit just dries up. And if you're a railroad and you're trying to build, you need a continual supply of dollars, and more dollars. So despite all of that, the Pacific Railroad does ask the state of Missouri for more bonds to help finish construction. They are past Jefferson City. They are building east out of Kansas City, but the 2 lines haven't connected yet. Right now, they're running kind of a hybrid railroad river connection where steamboats will take passengers and freight to Kansas City and bring it to the river landing at Jefferson City. And at this time, the governor of Missouri is Robert M. Stewart, favorite son of St. Joseph. He does not want to help the Pacific Railroad, and the Pacific Railroad has done itself no favors. He vetoes the bill to give them the bonds. The veto is overridden, but you can see how quickly the railroad has lost favor in the State House at this time. Now, the next year, they do keep building, and everyone does somehow struggle on. The Iron Mountain makes it to Pilot Knob in appropriately named Iron County, Missouri, where there is an iron mine and iron resources. And in 1859, the Hannibal and St. Joseph on February 14th runs its first train across the state of Missouri. So things are looking really great, at least for one railroad. And in general, now that there's a railroad across the state of Missouri, so much the better. One other thing has happened in the 1850s that I don't mention here because it didn't happen in Missouri, but it does impact Missouri. Someone's built a railroad bridge across the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, it's not in Missouri, it's in Rock Island, Illinois. And that is something that really starts to concern the railroad interests, particularly in Hannibal and St. Louis, because now Eastern railroads can go across the Mississippi and go further west, and they don't have to go through either of those 2 towns. St. Louis is going to start wanting to get a bridge built. It's been trying to get a bridge built in the 1850s, and every time they try, The state of Missouri votes for it. The U.S. Congress votes for it, but the state of Illinois shoots it down. And there's a long and varied story that I could make another presentation about. But suffice to say, the Illinois state legislature at the time was the finest legislature that money could buy, and that's competing against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So the railroads are built. It's 1859. Things are going okay. Everyone knows from hopefully American history class what else is going on nationally. There's a lot of sectionalism about slavery, a disagreement about emancipation and the expansion of slavery in the territories acquired from Mexico. And it's all going to lead in 1861 to civil war. And in Missouri, the state technically stays in the Union, but to be quite honest, it becomes a free fire zone. The railroads, and this is an image from the Post-Dispatch, and it's a very easy to follow map of what the railroad situation is in 1861 here. You've got the Iron Mountain that goes down to Pilot Knob and doesn't go any further. You've got the Southwest branch of the Pacific that goes to Rolla and doesn't go any further. You've got the Pacific Railroad that gets you to Sedalia and doesn't go any further. The only railroad that gets you across the state is the Hannibal and St. Joseph and the connection with the North Missouri. That doesn't really get you to where you need to go in terms of fighting the Confederate Army in Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Nevertheless, Confederate forces look at these railroads as threats. Pro-Confederate forces in the state of Missouri very quickly act to damage and tear up these railroads shortly after the war begins. And when active campaigns do start, particularly in the southwestern portion of the state, the Southwest Branch, the Pacific Railroad, and the Iron Mountain all become vital supply lines to Union armies in the field. And because of that, that makes them targets for Confederate forces. And to a lesser extent, the North Missouri and the Hannibal and St. Joseph become targets for Confederate forces as they raid throughout the state of Missouri. It's a very difficult time to run a railroad in Missouri during the Civil War. You're continually doing repairs. Your workers are either walking away from the job because they don't like being shot at, or they're literally getting drafted into service. It still doesn't mean good things aren't happening. The Hannibal and St. Joseph decides they're going to try out this new idea about putting a post office on rails to speed up mail delivery. By sorting the mail in transit, that takes a day off the time that the mail has to be in process going from point A to point B. So instead of delivering it to a post office where they sort the mail and take it to the next delivery point, you do that while it's moving. The bag's ready to go. You hand it to the Overland Mail, and off they go. Interestingly enough, this was an 1862 innovation in a state that was completely unsettled, but they're looking at improving service, improving the railroad, trying to do the best job they can during a very difficult situation. Again, 1864 is a very hard year because of Price's raids in Missouri. The Pacific Railroad is a target, the Southwest Branch is a target, the Iron Mountain is a target, the Hannibal and St. Joseph, the Platte County Railroad. All of these railroads get some form of damage. And honestly, Price's raid in 1864 is really the last gasp of Confederate military operations against the railroads, and things start to calm down. And finally, in 1865, the railroads really can start finishing some of the work they had been trying to accomplish, particularly the Pacific Railroad of Missouri. You get in 1865, the Pacific Road finally finishes its work and connects at Little Blue in Missouri, which is Kansas City. They are now second place, honestly third place, if you can count the North Missouri Railroad connecting at Macon County with the Hannibal and St. Joseph, but now at least St. Joseph, St. Louis, and Kansas City have a direct rail connection in place. Unfortunately, it has been ruinously expensive to build and very difficult, and they are now in a state that is devastated by what a historian would call the hard hand of war. Because of this, the Pacific Railroad needs to raise funds. One of the conditions of getting state bonds is you do have to pay the interest on the bonds. And so to get cash, the Pacific Railroad starts spinning off assets. In this case, the Southwest branch in 1866 is spun off as an independent company. That is designed to try and keep the Pacific Railroad afloat and ahead of the creditor, which in this case is the state of Missouri. The railroad gets incorporated as the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company, and a familiar face to Missourians, John C. Fremont on the right, is now installed as the president. And one of the first things they do is they start forming alliances with railroads looking into the South and West, because that's where they're pointed. They build the line to Springfield, and they start working with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe at connecting a railroad between the Midwest and the Pacific coast. And this goes fairly well until, you know, things start to get a little wobbly economically again in the 1870s. But, you know, things look promising. The war's over. We're trying to get our act together. There's outside capital. It's great. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to finally get some of these bridges built that we want. St. Louis doesn't get the bridge built across the Mississippi just yet, but they do build a bridge across the Missouri River at St. Charles, Missouri. It winds up getting called the Wabash Bridge, even though at the time the railroad that builds it is the North Missouri Railroad. And that replaces this very railroad ferry in St. Charles. Kansas City builds a bridge across the Missouri River. In this case, it's the Hannibal and St. Joseph that build it. So it's called the Hannibal Bridge, but it's in Kansas City. And as reconstruction of the ruined part of Missouri and the South in general starts getting underway, new opportunities for railroad development show up. In this case, people in Kansas City start looking at Texas, cattle and cotton as two potential cash commodities, and getting settlers into these areas. And they decide it would be a really good idea if we built a railroad into this part of Texas to start bringing cattle, cotton up out of that state, rather than having the cattle driven overland by on trails to towns like Sedalia. If you've ever seen Red River, 1948 Howard Hawks movie, they're getting to a railhead. That's what the cattle drive is trying to do. And the idea being, well, let's bring the railroad to where the cattle are, and that way we make the trip even more efficient. So in 1871, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas get started, straight up going from Missouri to Kansas to Texas. The St. Louis Iron Mountain route, they start getting some expansion. Unfortunately, they have to get foreclosed on in the 1860s to get their act together. Again, couldn't pay interest on state bonds, so the state winds up buying them at auction. And the new owners reorganize the company, and then it gets reorganized again in the 1870s. And finally, they start going south into Texas. The Cairo and Fulton Railroad gets basically brought into the Iron Mountain route, and they go south across Arkansas, south from St. Louis, and go to Texarkana, Texas, again, getting into the cotton and cattle market, and bring those commodities into St. Louis and to points east. The Pacific Railroad, despite its best efforts to stave off its creditors, just can't seem to do it. And in 1872, they go under receivership and get reorganized as the Missouri Pacific Railroad. This is a better situation than where they were, but 1872 is not going to be a harbinger of a great year coming up. There's another panic on the way, but at least they've got their financial affairs in order enough that the state creditors are off their back. Now, as Missouri's getting its act together and Texas and the Southwest starting getting developed, the 900-pound gorilla in the room, which is Chicago, starts looking at the Southwest and says, we are not going to let St. Louis dominate this market on its own. And Chicago railroads decide they're going to get into the state of Missouri. And the first entry is the Chicago and Alton Railroad. And they build a bridge across the Mississippi in 1873 at Louisiana, Missouri. And that connects with a railroad line they're building from Louisiana to Kansas City. And the idea being they're going to tap all the traffic that's going into Kansas City, from the Kansas Pacific, from the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, tap all of that and bring it up to Chicago and bypass St. Louis. This is part of a long-standing economic competition between Chicago and St. Louis. And to be quite honest, at times it seems Chicago is Lucy in the football to our Charlie Brown. This is why we can't have nice things. Now, I just mentioned the bridge at Louisiana, and I mentioned earlier the bridge at Rock Island. There's still no bridge at St. Louis. The Wiggins Ferry Company still is effectively blocking, in conjunction with interest from Chicago, any railroad bill in the Illinois state legislature to get a bridge built across the Mississippi. In 1873, we have more economic problems that caused the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad to have to get reorganized, and they get their name changed. And while that's underway, someone finally has a moment where they get the Wiggins Ferry Company to drop their objections, mainly by bringing them into the bridge company. And in 1874, St. Louis finally gets its bridge across the Mississippi River. So now the state of Missouri has not one, but two bridges across the Mississippi, not one, but two railroads that go to the Kansas City area and now cross the Mississippi and connect with eastern railroads. And they are continuing to expand south and west, despite economic hardship, war, floods, political malfeasance, and just bad luck. It has been a titanic struggle to get this work done. In addition, St. Louis builds a Union Station, which can handle an earth-shattering number of 14 trains. And almost immediately after the station is open, they realize the station is not big enough to do the job we need it to do. So they start looking at new options. As St. Louis continues to develop, further outside interests start looking at Missouri's railroads. The Missouri Northern gets reorganized as the St. Louis, Kansas City and Northern Railroad. And in 1879, it gets merged with the Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific into the Wabash Railroad. In 1878, Kansas City gets its Union Station built. They build their railroad station in the West Bottoms area. Unfortunately, literally being in the West Bottoms makes it susceptible to flood damage. And just like St. Louis's Union Station, they see the situation and realize this is not going to work out in the long term. While Kansas City's getting developed, other things have happened. The partnership between the Atchison, Topeka, and the Atlantic and Pacific Railroads has died in the Panic of 1873. And the Santa Fe, rather than continuing to use St. Louis as its eastern terminal, has decided, you know what? We're going to go it alone and build our own railroad. We're going to go to Chicago. Again, frustrating, but at least the railroad's going through Missouri. This line is actually still in use today as the Northern Transcom line. If you want to watch trains on it, there are a couple of webcams that are quite active that you can spend hours watching trains zoom by. That was the impetus of T. Jefferson Coolidge, the Santa Fe president at the time. He was not going to have his railroad be dependent on another railroad for a major eastern connection. And while Kansas City is nice, it's still west of what had been essentially a cartel-like dividing line between the eastern railroads and the western railroads, which was the Mississippi River. So he decided, we are going to go to Chicago and get on the other side of the line and connect with these eastern railroads directly. Now, the eastern railroads and their money, which was mainly based out of New York, started looking at the Midwestern railroads and deciding, well, we're going to respect this dividing line that the two pools of railroads have set up along the Mississippi River. That doesn't mean we can't buy railroads on the other side of the Mississippi River. On the left, Jay Gould, who had bought and controlled and fought over the Erie, winds up buying the Missouri Pacific, the St. Louis Iron Mountain, and the Wabash Railroads, and forms the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis. And on the right, E.H. Harriman winds up buying the Chicago and Alton Railroad. Outside of the New York capital, we've got Boston capital, and we have guys like John Murray Forbes and Charles E. Perkins, who are controlling the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads, they decide they're going to take over the Hannibal and St. Joseph. This sets up the Burlington route system that crosses Missouri and sets them up to expand into Nebraska and into the Rocky Mountains and Montana. With all of Missouri's railroads now essentially controlled by outsiders, it was terribly frustrating for local commercial interests and industrialists to see their traffic at the mercy of outsiders and their freight rates. That led to people like Arthur Stillwell in Kansas City decide, I'm going to build my own railroad south of Kansas City and go into Texas to connect the city directly with a home-owned company to the Gulf Coast. Now, he starts the Kansas City, Nevada, and Fort Smith, and it gets reorganized into the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf Railroad. And Arthur Stillwell is kind of like the John C. Fremont of economics. He's got a lot of vision and a lot of enthusiasm, but he just doesn't seem to have the luck. And I'll show you how bad his luck was. The KC, Pittsburgh, and Gulf is in dire economic straits and finally gets to a point where a printer's bill is unpaid. This leads to a board meeting where Stillwell's already somewhat hostile directors and outside investors decide this is going to be the end of him. He gets voted out of office of the railroad that he envisioned and replaced by a guy named John William Gates, who's again an outside investor. Shortly after Stillwell was kicked out of the KC, Pittsburgh, and Gulf, oil was discovered under the railroad lands, and the railroad is essentially set financially for the rest of its life. It does wind up getting to Port Arthur, Texas on September 11th of 1897, and John William Gates parlays the success with the oil discovery into forming a small company of his own, a nice little success story called Texaco, which some of you may have heard of. Continuing with the theme of local interests unhappy with outsiders controlling the railroad infrastructure, St. Louis commercial interests looked at the Eads Bridge, which was now controlled by Gould's Terminal Railroad Association, and decided we were going to build our own bridge and charge tariffs that were not going to go to outside Missouri pockets, but rather stay local. And they formed the Merchants Bridge Company, and in 1889 through 1890 built a beautiful brand new bridge across the Mississippi River between St. Louis and Venice, Illinois. Gould, having control of many of the railroads on both sides of the river, promptly makes sure that none of his trains use that bridge, and the company is forced into bankruptcy. Whereupon, does anyone want to guess which railroad comes in and swoops it up and buys it at the bankruptcy sale? Yes, you're right, the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis. One thing can be said, though, that Gould did give St. Louis a beautiful Union Station in 1894, 10 years before the city hosted the Olympics and the St. Louis World's Fair, and again, another structure that still stands to this day and well worth a visit. It was at one time the busiest railroad station in the United States, serving 22 million passengers in a year. This happened to be during World War II. It was also crucially a point for passenger transfer between the Eastern railroads and the Western railroads, because again, with one exception in St. Louis, the Wabash, no East Coast Railroad operated west of the Mississippi River, and no Western Railroad operated east of the Mississippi River. So if you were going between the two sides of the river, say you're going from one coast to the other, and you're going through St. Louis, your car was going to go in St. Station. You were either going to have to get out and walk, or your sleeper car was going to be transferred to another railroad to continue your journey. And again, the station still exists to this day. You can see the scope when you get a chance to walk through it and just how massive it was. And imagine all the trains going in and out during its heyday. So that's where Missouri's railroads are at the end of the 19th century. This map actually is a really good representation of it. There's a couple of railroads that aren't here yet that you may be looking for. One of them is the Rock Island. The Rock Island isn't going to be finished across the state until 1904. So technically it doesn't fall under the rubric of this presentation. And the Katy doesn't build its own railroad line across the northern part of the north shore of the Missouri River, again, until the 20th century. So I didn't put that in here. But if you do want to continue your own research, you can certainly use the collections here at the St. Louis Mercantile Library. I highly recommend visiting the Barriger Railroad Collection. Again, a shameless plug for my work. Help keep us employed. The Library of Congress is a wonderful map and photographic collection that you can utilize. The David Rumsey Collection is another great cartographic resource. Kansas State Historical Society, the Kansas City History Museum, the Missouri State Historical Society, the Missouri History Museum, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch has done some really great commemorative articles on Missouri's railroad history. So again, thank you very much for joining me. I will open it up now for questions. So if anybody has any, please feel free to put them into the chats. Thank you all very much for who made it through this. It's been kind of a marathon. Thanks, John. I appreciate the compliment. Yeah, I'm a big map person also. So if you see a lot of my presentations in person or on PowerPoint, there are plenty of maps in there. And thanks, David Hulsing, for the question, for the compliment. And thank you, Tom, for the compliment. And again, nobody else has any questions. I know it's been kind of a long day for everyone, but thank you all very, very much. If you do think of something afterwards, you can email me at fryn@umsl.edu, or just go to the St. Louis Mercantile Library webpage, click on staff, and you can get a hold of us that way. So I'd like to thank John Ott and Bernie Kopinski for devoting part of their Saturday for this. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined us in person today, if not for all, even for part of the day. These don't get done again if people don't show up. So thank you again for your patronage. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Nick.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
All right, everybody have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll probably have these online Monday or Tuesday. And I will send out emails to everybody who registered, and feel free to share them around if you'd like.
Yep.
All right. Thanks
Cool.
a lot, everyone.
See you,
Nick.
See ya.